We think their entire day is about the 50 minutes they spend with us from,
Yep.
10 to 10:50. That's just not it. So
Yep.
it's a successful presentation if you can get somebody to remember your big idea.
Welcome to MRII's Insights and Innovators podcast, where we talk to top market research professionals to get their inside stories about innovative and enduring best practices. Now, here's your host for today's episode.
Welcome to today's episode, From Data to Drama, Bring Your Insights to Life with Kantar's J. Walker Smith. I'm Z Johnson. I'm delighted to be joined today by a highly regarded and veteran public speaker in our industry, Chief Knowledge Officer at Kantar, J. Walker Smith. Walker has spent more than 3 decades studying how to connect data with people, whether in rooms of 10 or auditoriums of thousands. From keynote speakers and TEDx talks to boardroom presentations with large-scale webinars, he knows what works and what doesn't when it comes to the art and science of storytelling with data. Walker, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks very much. Very glad to be here. And thanks for that very generous introduction. I appreciate it.
Anytime.
Sure.
So let me start with this.
Yeah.
Why is it that so many presentations, especially in research,
Yeah.
are so completely forgettable?
Well, we like our numbers too much, I think would be my one sort of thought about that, which is not to say that numbers are unimportant, but it is to say that researchers, don't like to be inauthentic. So they don't like to perform. They don't like to put on a persona. They don't like to adopt, a costume or whatever you might call it. They just want to come into the room and kind of talk about the numbers, and that's great for a lot of audiences, but it's not great for senior audiences within our clients who are not, so much grounded in the numbers like researchers. They really want to know the central idea, the one takeaway, what they should do, the choice or the decision they should make. They're really looking for some insights into what I talk about or describe as kind of the narrative story of the marketplace that they have in their heads. Everybody who runs a business has kind of a little narrative in their minds about how the marketplace works. Here's how competitors work. Here's how our products fit together. Here's how consumers use them. Here's how we sell them. It's all kind of an interlocking little story about the marketplace. And when we're talking to them, we're kind of talking to them about having a better story about the marketplace, a better understanding of the marketplace. And so numbers are important for us to be able to say things that are true, things that are going to work, things that can actually have an impact. But it's not really about the numbers. It's about getting through to the decision maker. And that is really all about delivery more than data. So I just think that's underappreciated by researchers. When I was in graduate school, just kind of wrap this up here. When I was in graduate school, my dissertation advisor told me that the most skeptical people in the world are newspaper reporters and social scientists. They're always asking questions. They never believe anything you have to say to them. No matter what you say to them, they're gonna fire back at you with all kinds of nitpicking and rebuttal points. And that's all good, but it's not the way in which we can have an impact on the businesses that we're supposed to help and supposed to improve. And that's about narrative. That's about storytelling. It's about the data making a difference, not the data per se.
Yeah, yeah, so true. So true. I love that. Yeah, social scientists and journalists, we're always kind of like, mm-mm. Tell me
Yeah.
where that came from.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, which is good. We need people like that. The fourth estate, is pretty important. I think of
Yeah,
research as kind of the fourth estate in marketing.
yeah,
But at some point, business leaders, they've got to choose A or B.
yeah,
And if we want to have an impact on that, we've got to get through to them.
yeah, absolutely. So you've delivered presentations to rooms of 10, auditoriums of thousands. Can you start by sharing a little bit of your experience as a presenter and communicator and what shaped your thinking and what makes a presentation great?
Well, I would say what makes a presentation great is sort of the experience of doing all those presentations that aren't great. You kind of learn the things that don't work. You learn what it is you say that people get confused by, that people really don't like.
Yeah,
And I think my experience is a little bit different than kind of the typical person in our profession. I was one of these high school and college debaters forever, and most debaters go off and be lawyers. So they don't really go off and be market researchers. There are a
right.
few of us. So I really came into market research just, since 14 years old, I've been just talking and arguing and trying to get points across and trying to persuade people. You're always trying
Yeah,
to persuade a judge to vote for you instead of vote for somebody else. So,
right.
so there are all those kind of things that I learned and I've carried with me in the work that I do, trying to tell stories with data. That's how I kind of describe myself. But I think the bit of feedback that you get that lets you know you're kind of on the right track is when people can come up to you later and play back to you kind of the one thing that you were trying to get across to them. And I liken this to advertising. When we
Yep.
do advertising testing, one of the things we do is part of that is we always kind of ask respondents, what was the one thing that this ad was trying to communicate to you? If you could
Right.
tell us in your own words what
Right.
this ad was all about, what is that? And that's always a good check on our advertising because we know from the creative brief what the message was we were trying to get across. So if you
Yep.
don't see that message being played back by respondents, then you know that the ad didn't work. And I think that's the exact same in the presentations we do.
Yeah.
Was the message you're trying to get across the thing that people say back to you is the thing that they remember? And I think that's a really telling kind of bit of feedback. If they're not really remembering the key point, it doesn't really matter what else they remember. They have forgotten that you told them to do A instead of B, and that
Yep.
just you didn't get it done very well.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes me think one of the things that as a presenter, especially a market research presenter, that you can do
Yeah.
for yourself is look at your presentation and go, do I only have one key point?
Right. Yeah. No, and I got a theory of one thing, actually. I think every presentation should be about one thing. Now people go to me, well, I'm presenting segmentation data. Well, when you're presenting segmentation data, you've done a lot of analysis, and you've settled on a few key things that you think are the best way in which to divide uh, consumers in the marketplace
Hmm.
into different groups with different priorities of how you would approach them and how you would invest behind trying to win their business.
Right.
And those dimensions that you have used to segment the marketplace are a bit of a narrative about the marketplace. Here's what drives the marketplace.
Yeah.
These are the dimensions that really account for different kinds of preferences in the marketplace. So even when you're presenting segmentation data, there is a story of the marketplace in the work that you've done. Now I haven't presented segmentation data in a very long time. Most of what I talk about these days is kind of macro futures or consumer value and lifestyle trends. So I'm doing some things where it's kind of easier to tell a story of the marketplace, but
Sure.
I think that applies to everything we do with data. We are always telling stories with data,
Yep.
and you're trying to get a point across.
Yeah. Love it. Um, would you say that the same principles apply regardless of the audience size? So you're
Yeah,
presenting to a boardroom,
right,
presenting in a ballroom.
right.
Same
Yeah.
principles apply?
Well, they do apply, although you do them a little bit differently. When you're presenting in a ballroom, a lot of what you try to do is entertain people. So,
Yeah.
if you're at a conference and you're not telling a couple of jokes about yourself. Now, don't tell jokes about other people. That never works. But tell jokes
Yeah.
about yourself. If you don't kind of win the audience over, and you're personable and people enjoy listening to you, then you really haven't succeeded in a conference setting. So
Mm,
that's so a little bit of what you're trying to do in a conference is kind of entertain people, not in the stand-up comic kind of sense of
right.
entertainment, but certainly you want to get people engaged. You want them leaning forward in their seats. So that's actually one of the signs, one of the things I look for in the audience, whether it's 10 or 1,000, is are people leaning forward to kind of hear what I have to say. If you're in a room with 10 people, that's probably going to be a little bit more of a conversation, a little bit more of a discussion. And typically, if it's 10 people, it's senior people. They've got a big issue at hand. You're there
Hmm.
to help them in a moment of decision or sometimes a moment of crisis. You're not really there to entertain. You're
Right.
there to be much more of a consultant at their elbow, helping them make some difficult decisions. So the tonality is very different there. But in both cases, you're telling stories with data and you're trying to communicate a central idea. Now,
Yeah.
there'll be a lot of detail about it, but here's the big idea. Now I'm going to tell you 10 things about it, but it's these 10 things are all about this one kind of core takeaway or core idea. And
Sure.
that's the same in both settings. And if you can do that, you'll win the audience over, whether it's 10 or 1,000 people.
Yeah. Yeah. You keep talking, referring to the one thing,
Right.
right? You
Yeah.
focus on a one thing.
Yeah.
Why is that so important? Why is it so important to focus on that one thing?
Well, we love our numbers, so we come in with 100 charts, and we think everybody's going to remember everything we presented. And we kind of forget that we're sandwiched in between one meeting, that where there were some serious things being discussed, and another meeting they're not looking forward to. That's
Yeah.
going to be the most boring meeting of the day at 4:30 in the afternoon. We're kind of sandwiched in between all that stuff, and
Yeah.
so we're lucky if people can remember one thing. They're certainly
Yeah.
not going to remember 50. They're not going to remember 10.
Yeah.
We'll be lucky if they remember three. So I think just, the reality of the moment is something that we often forget. We think their entire day is about the 50 minutes they spend with us from,
Yep.
10 to 10:50. That's just not it. So
Yep.
it's a successful presentation if you can get somebody to remember your big idea. And
Yep.
oftentimes people won't even remember one thing about you. They'll enjoy the meeting and then they'll leave, and the next day everything is forgotten. The other importance of one thing is, our brains work in kind of memory bundles. There's
Hmm.
sort of something that triggers a memory bundle. So you've done a good job presenting one thing. If you give all the texture and the detail associated with it, but you don't want people to try and remember all of that. You want them to remember the one thing. And if they remember the one thing, then it will kind of unlock everything else. So,
Right.
so that's what you're really trying to do. Now, that does mean you've got to kind of structure your presentation in a way that things all sort of fit together logically and
Yep.
dovetail so that when they remember one thing, it's easy for things to unlock in
Yeah.
their minds. But I think if you can get that one thing, then that's a real accomplishment, because most of the times when you present to people, they don't even remember one thing, or they don't remember it very long,
Right.
and it just doesn't have the impact that you could have if you really focused on one thing and made that your benchmark of success.
Yeah. Um, you talk about in some of your advice on presentations, you talk about a headline and a formula for making a really great headline.
Right, right.
Walk us through that
Sure.
formula for a headline to make it memorable.
So the way I put it is to say, a great headline, or a great one thing should roll off your tongue with rhythm and snap. So,
Okay.
and what I just told you is one thing.
Yep.
And I'll bet you somebody out there is going to remember that, roll off your tongue with rhythm and snap. So
Yeah.
that means a good headline kind of has four characteristics. So it's evocative. It kind of speaks to the idea. It's friendly, so you're not using, jargon.
Yeah.
Don't use jargon. Don't use big words. Big words are not your friend. It has some poetic cadence to it. So we always talk with a certain kind of poetic cadence, whether we realize it or not. Even the most inveterate researcher, who thinks they're all about numbers, there is a cadence to the way they talk. So
Yeah.
there should be a little, there should be a little lilt to the step of the headline, and it should be in the active voice. Sure, you should be say it should be demonstrative. You should be telling people something to do. So I'll give you a couple of examples of mine.
Yeah.
So about a decade ago, I started talking about what's going to happen to the shopper journey when smart technologies take over shopping. Now, today we understand that as AI assisted apps.
Yep.
So what happens when consumers get a hold of apps? Well, I said, they're going to hand off all their shopping to these algorithms, these technologies, and they'll never watch ads again. So we'll have to figure out how to advertise to algorithms. So that was my headline. The future is advertising to algorithms. So that
Yeah.
kind of rolls off your tongue with rhythm and snap. It has a cadence to it. It's short. It's kind of memorable. Another one that I talked about a while ago in the wake of the financial crisis, 2007, 8, 9, and 10,
Hmm.
as consumers were trying to re-engage with the marketplace. We went through a 6-year unemployment recession, all those kind of difficult economic times. I used to characterize the consumer mindset as one of live large, carry little. So people still had big ambitions and aspirations, but they were
Yep.
trying to do so in much more affordable ways that, didn't have as big an environmental footprint and all the other kind of values that were
Yep.
emerging as important. So I called it live large, carry little. Now, there was one headline that I've taken unending grief about within Kantar when I wrote a report about millennials as they were emerging right around the turn of the century, 2001, 2, 3. And it was a report I wrote that I called A Crisis of Chrysalis. Chrysalis being that stage that insect, the butterflies go through to turn into
Right.
butterflies. Well, everybody thought that was the dumbest thing they'd ever heard, and clients did too. So this is something that I've had to live with ever since the crisis of chrysalis. So sometimes you try too hard. I was trying too hard,
Yeah.
but there are other things that kind of work. So I think and if you can get a headline like that, people remember it. People have come up to me 15 or more years later after they first heard live large, carry little. And they say that to me and they ask me, is this still true of consumers or advertising algorithms is
Yeah.
still kind of the way in which we talk about this emerging age of AI assisted shopping. I think these things really matter
Yeah.
if you're trying to get a message across.
Yeah. Love it. Now, you talk about the one thing, and we've got the headline, and now
Yeah.
let's dive into the story. So you talk about the story with ha ha,
Yeah.
uh-huh, and then aha, and
Right.
amen. So
Right.
let's talk through that
Well,
structure.
so I stole that from a storytelling guide. So I picked up a book in the bookstore one day about storytellers. So there are
Yep.
these people who go around as professional storytellers.
Yep.
And there was one person there talking about a framework that she used, and she said she always starts with a little bit of humor, the ha-ha. So I've learned the hard way that you do need a little bit of humor, but it always has to be self-deprecating. If you try and
Yep.
tell jokes about other people, you're going to unintentionally, well, A, I'm not a comedian, so I'm not good at telling jokes about other people. B, every time I do it, I manage to insult somebody in the audience. So I just tell jokes about myself.
Yeah.
So, but you have to start with a little bit. You've got to personalize yourself for the audience. You've got to warm up to them. You've got to kind of open your arms and bring them closer. And then there's the where you say, okay, here's what I want to talk about. So I always tell people what my conclusion is at the very beginning. I don't wait for surprise slides at the end. If
Yep.
you're in a meeting of 10 people, you're going to run out of time. So you're always going to run out of time. So
Yep.
don't wait until the very end to tell people what your conclusion is. Tell people what your conclusion is at the very start. And that's kind of the And then I say, and now I believe in magic numbers. So I say, all right, I'm going to tell you three things I'm going to explain one thing to you in three dimensions
Sure.
or with three ideas. And then at the end of each of those three, you kind of get to a little aha moment. It's kind of like, all right, I've told you this, I've told you this. Now here's kind of the conclusion, the take. Oh, now I see that in the data. There's the aha. So it's kind of the aha and the aha. You sort of work that through a few times, and then you get to the amen. So I grew up in the South. I believe in altar calls, and I think and there's a recency effect,
Yes.
so the way people remember any experience is what happens at the very end. So you want the very end to be inspirational. You want it to be upbeat, not downbeat.
Yep.
You want to repeat your one thing, and I call it the amen moment. So that's how I think about presenting. I start by trying to personalize. I give people kind of the things I want them to remember all around one thing, the and the aha moments, and then I do an altar call at the end to get people on board
Yeah.
with making decision A instead of making decision B.
Yeah. Um, so you've also said that presentations aren't a stack of charts, they're a story.
Right.
What's your advice for people who rely really heavily on those slides?
Yeah. So I have ways that I build decks and ways that I build slides, and I do them in opposite ways. So I build a deck by putting every possible slide into the deck, and then I start taking slides out, deliberately taking slides out until I get to a point where I know what my essential slides are.
Okay.
And the way I build a deck is I start with a blank piece of paper and I put one thing on it at a time until I've got just enough to tell the story. The
Hmm.
mistake we make with slides is we to put too much stuff on there. So,
Yep.
if we do a line chart, you don't actually have to put the number at every point along the line. You can put the number at the beginning and the number at the end, and people can see the shape of the curve.
Yeah.
So what do you actually need? So the advice is be very clear to yourself about what the most important data points are.
Mhm.
If there was one piece of data that you want people to see,
Yep.
what is that one piece of data? And you may say, well, I got 50 pieces of data. Well, what if the CEO can give you 5 minutes? What one piece of data do you want to make sure that person sees?
Yep.
So I think it is just being very clear on what's essential and what's not essential. And I'll just tell you, 95% of the data that we throw into presentations is just not essential. So it is being very parsimonious with what we present, and you've got to be disciplined
Oh
about that.
yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
hard thing to learn, but
Yeah.
what you really need, the other thing I say is give this presentation to your mother, quote unquote, give it to your mother. And if your mother can understand it, then you've got a presentation to present,
Yep.
because we put these things together and we go, oh, this is great. Well, we're talking to ourselves. Get an outside pair of eyes to look at it and ask that person, just say that person, if you could take 10 slides out of this deck, which 10 slides would you take out? And you might go, oh God, you can't take out those slides, but this is an outside set of eyes.
Yep.
And editors are paid to edit. They are trained to edit. Asking your friends is not an editor, but it's the same thing.
Yep.
Listen to editors because they can tell you when you're making sense and when you're not making sense.
Yeah. I've been an editor in the past, and yeah, it's hard to tear someone else's stuff apart because
I know,
you
I
know
know.
that something in there is really precious.
Gotta go. Yeah,
It was painful for both of us.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so you've also said that the perfect presentation is one slide. I love
Right,
that everything comes back to just one.
right,
And the idea of a perfect presentation being one slide is very provocative.
right.
So explain the one slide idea.
Yeah. Well, when I teach presenting, I've got a few examples that I use of that. But the perfect one slide is essentially a framework of some sort,
Okay.
in which which embodies your big idea, and then you can use the framework to draw it out and talk about the big idea. So a very simple example that everybody's familiar with is the inverted pyramid. The kind of the shopper journey or the media
Yep.
buying process. All that kind of stuff. Well, that's a perfect one slide because you can say, look. What we did was a bit of research about your shopper journey, which starts here at the top and goes here to the bottom. Now, let me just tell you what we've learned each step of the way. And you don't need to show all that data. You can just say, look, you're perfectly fine at the top of this funnel here, and you're great at the bottom, but where you're missing the boat is here in the middle, and then you can begin to talk about that, and you can do the entire presentation with just that one slide. Now, you'd love to show all the data,
Right.
but well, your takeaway is about where they're missing the boat here and sort of, transitioning from one part of the funnel to the next part of the funnel. You can do that with one slide. I'll give you a little story about this. So back in ancient history, I was at a firm called Yankelovich, which was eventually merged into Kantar. And a woman and I were sent off by our CEO to a client and told that we had to present a proposal for a concept testing study.
Yep.
So we were handed, we were like handed this, go sell this. So we went off to the client and walked in the room, and the client stood up and introduced me to her senior management, the CEO of her division of the company, and a couple of his direct reports, that we were here to present our version of this segmentation study proposal. And I
Oh
looked at
no.
and Chris looked at me and we went, segmentation? I thought this was a concept testing study. We had a long, sort of proposal for concept testing. And I just said to Chris, I said, all right, well, okay, here goes. Watch this. So this is back in the days, this is how old I am. This is back in the days of overhead transparencies. So I pulled out, so in the back of every proposal, we had one page on every type of study that we did, which included our one page on segmentation that had a graphic, which was our framework for segmentation. So I pulled that out and I put that up on the overhead projector and I said, I bet a lot of people have come in here and they've told you how they're going to do this segmentation study. I'm going to talk to you about what kind of segmentation study you should do, what you should be looking at, what you should be researching, and the kinds of questions that you should be answering with segmentation. I'm going to give you our philosophy of segmentation. And so I talked about that with our framework. And I said, this is the kind of work that we want to do for you. And the whole time running through my head, I was thinking, please don't ask me about budget. Please don't ask me about budget. They asked me about budget. So I had to put up our budget slide, which that was the other. I only put up two slides. That was the other slide, which maybe I should have had a reserve budget slide as well. Kind of hedge my bets. So we wound up winning that work and doing that research at a significant
Wow.
because it was a big client of ours. And Mr. Ed Keller can tell you about that because he was our competition for that study. He'd actually presented a segmentation proposal. And so I'm sure if he'd done it, he would have made money. We actually won that study and lost money because of our CEO kind of getting everything wrong. But at any rate,
Whoa.
it was one slide. That's all I needed. All I
Yep.
needed was that one slide with a framework.
Yep. Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Insights and Innovators. We hope that you're leaving with a fresh set of ideas and inspiration to make your next presentation more memorable and impactful.
Thanks for joining the Insights and Innovators podcast from Market Research Institute International. Click subscribe to never miss an episode and visit us at mrii.org for more market research insights.